Good afternoon. Hello, I'm Lilian Turri, Cambridge University Press Country Manager in Chile. This first conference on bilingual education is an initiative run by a group of national and international institutions in Chile dedicated to bringing together leading academics, researchers, school administrators, and teachers to exchange and share their experiences and results in all aspects and other contexts of bilingual education. We hope that this is the first of many other conferences and events that we will organize and generate with the support and effort of our partners who are also present today. The mission of the Cambridge University is to contribute to the pursuit of education, learning, and research at the highest international levels of excellence. So, welcome to the conference and thanks for attending. Joaquin.
Okay, hello everybody once again. This is Joaquín Triandafilide speaking, Director at Comunidad Neuroeducas. A special thank you note to the institutions that made this first conference on bilingual education possible. Cambridge University Press, Universidad del Desarrollo, University of Edinburgh, the British Chamber of Commerce, and Comunidad Neuroeducas. We are very excited to see that this first conference is making it possible for 300 educators from Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and some other countries in the world to have this getting together here. We want to thank you for choosing to be here today and tomorrow, and would like to kindly suggest to follow protocols of communication in every session through the conference. This will help us all to have experience. A quick overview of day one. There will be 4 individual sessions with 20 minutes in between each for you to take a break. And now I want to pass it on to Pilar Zárate from Cambridge University Press, Chile. Pilar?
Hi, Joaquin. Hello, teachers. This is Pilar Zárate from Cambridge University Press. And today, I'm so glad to be here this Friday afternoon to open this series of conference presentations and to have the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Simon Lin. Simon has more than 15 years of experience teaching and leading departments at primary and secondary, private and international schools in the United Kingdom and Africa. A senior international education consultant with Cambridge University Press, Simon has worked for over six years helping Cambridge international schools around the world embed Cambridge resources and active learning strategies into their unique situations, including designing and teaching innovative teacher training in Southeast Asia, Asia, Pakistan, India, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. Today, Simon will talk to us about language awareness for bilingual schools and colleges, a key issue when teaching and learning in a second language. Simon will present some ideas to develop greater fluency in a second language through raising awareness of simple strategies and techniques that may help teachers and learners overcome difficulties. We are grateful for his presence among us today. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Simon. Welcome, Simon.
Good. And start video. Oh, good afternoon or good evening, everyone. And well, it's evening here in England, but good afternoon to all of you, wherever you may be. I'm going to start with a screen share and go through a very quick presentation for you should take 45 minutes or so. Thereafter, we've got plenty of time for questions. So just bear with me while I bring up the slideshow. And once again, here we are. So today, and for just a few minutes now, what we're going to be looking at is language awareness. Now, first of all, a little bit of an apology for me. My Spanish is not as fluent as I would like it to be. I set out some years ago with the great ambition that the countries that I would work in, I would learn to master their language. That didn't happen because I ended up going to so many different countries for relatively short periods of time that actually I couldn't develop the fluency in the 15 or 16 languages that I needed to do so. So I end up with just a basic knowledge of Spanish, a little bit of Italian, a little bit of French, a little bit of German, a little bit of Dutch, a little bit of Arabic, a little bit of various other different languages, but none of them well enough to be completely bilingual. And this is what we need to think about, is the way that we use and approach language education. I would like to think that by the end of this session, I hope that you will understand why we need to think about language awareness. I'm going to introduce you to some of the basic theories behind it, but I'm going to put them in my context, and the context within which I work, the schools that I work in, the teachers that I work with, and put it in an overall idea of how we at Cambridge, not just at Cambridge University Press, but within the university, within Cambridge Assessment, and within Cambridge English Language Assessment, how we try and embed everything into our resources, and how we encourage our teachers to actually use those resources. So I'm going to ask you a little question firstly. What language do you think in? And are you bilingual or trilingual? Unfortunately, there are far too many of us to actually do as I might like to do, which is to get you to very quickly type some answers into the chat box so that I can see them. But it's just something I want you to think about. But mostly, what language do you dream in? And what I want to see and think about here is that language and thought, and to a certain extent, even our personality, our identity, are bound up in who we are, what language we use. This becomes quite a challenge for many of the teachers that I work with around the world and many of the schools, because they have a home language and they have a working language. And sometimes in your working language, you're almost a different person to your home language. So we need to think about what is language about. When we're in the classroom, do we know when we ask a student a question and we don't get the answer that we want? Is that because they don't actually know? So think about, we might be in a science lesson or a mathematics lesson, and we ask the student a question and we don't get a good response. Now, is that because they don't know the science or the maths, or because they don't have the language skills to give a good response? They might know the answer, but perhaps, and again, I've seen this in many schools, where we have a school policy of only English in the classroom. Now, if we have a school policy of only English in the classroom, perhaps our students aren't being given a fair crack at showing their knowledge. So when we think about all of this, we need to consider what is it that we're actually doing. And I've been into some wonderful schools where we offer really bilingual learning, where lots of languages are spoken within the school, and often English is the only common language. I've also been into schools where they have one single language, perhaps Spanish, and they're learning in English. We need to think about the way that we work. Very often, language and identity are integrated, and we don't want to put our mother tongue, if you like, or our home language, we don't want to give that a negative context and say English is the only and the best. I've heard and I've seen that happening, and we need to be careful about that. I now want to move very quickly onto an approach that's very popular in Europe that we call CLIL, which is Content and Language Integrated Learning. And when we talk about content and language, they have to be very, very closely linked. Now, this is actually quite a challenging theory, but don't get too worried about it, because I've taken a step back and I've looked at how can we put this into a real world situation. And one of the reasons for doing that is that I often get told, well, I can't do it. How can I? I don't have the science knowledge. I don't have the maths knowledge. I don't have the language knowledge. And what am I? I'm a language teacher. And the key one that often happens, what happens if I make a mistake? I don't want to look stupid. Well, if we want to encourage learning in our schools, then all of us, teachers included, should feel free to occasionally not get everything right. We do make mistakes, but if we can acknowledge them as an opportunity to learn and grow, that's brilliant. So let's have a quick look at what language learning, and I will say this, used to be like. Because I know it does still happen, but what the traditional view was, and it's still very common in some countries where their approach to learning is fairly traditional. And that is what we think of and what I tend to call the grammar first approach. We learn the grammar, we learn the language structure, we memorize chunks of language. And then in a fairly artificial situation, we tend to practice it repeatedly. So that we might be sitting in a classroom, for example, learning English, and we say to our students, all right, today we are going to learn the present tense. We are going to learn about the language we use for going shopping. And we'll go and do all of the practice. This is an orange, this is a lemon, this is, and let's go shopping. It's not really the real world. They're not actually, yes, they might be learning language, they might remember it, but they're not actually out in a shop using the language. So one of the things that I would encourage us to do is to think about turning it round. And this is the communicative approach. And this is where we use language to communicate first. Then, if we need some additional support because our communication is not working as well as it might like, then we can bring in language, grammar, learning. So this reflects daily language use. This is the kind of language that we might see in the classroom. So think about the communicative approach. And this is very much tied in with the fact that, especially for children, we have certain strategies which we call natural language acquisition strategies. Now, for young children, this tends to happen from the ages of 2 or 3 when they are beginning to express themselves, they're learning language, up to about 9, 10, 11, they're still learning language. And they can actually learn multiple languages at the time. My niece and nephew are bilingual. They speak French and English. They speak French to their mum, English to their dad. And sitting at the dining room table is quite fascinating because mid-sentence they just switch languages depending on who they're talking to. So we need to think about how we learn language, and we learn it through using it. Now, when we look at this, we can go into the theory about it, and this is the 4 C's model, if you like, and it's a slightly different to the 4 C's, although there are similar ones. It's slightly different to the 21st century 4 C's, but the key one is communication. So there's content obviously in the middle, and English language can have content, and it's communication. But there, look at the communication, and what it is it's using languages to learn and learning to use languages. Another way of, I've seen this expressed, and it's part of some of our English course, is learning to read and reading to learn. It's a skill. It's something that we need to develop. Part of it is cognition. We express our learning. We think in a language. If we struggle with the language itself, if we don't have the breadth of vocabulary, then it can affect our thinking skills. It can affect our problem solving. Culture is the other of the C's. There on the screen, we've got intercultural understanding, but it goes slightly beyond that, because it's also the culture that we have within our school, the culture of learning. Do we encourage our students to speak English fluently and freely, not just in school, not just in lessons, but around the school? Do we encourage that? Do we have English development days? Lots of things that we do within that. But it's also, does our learning and does our approach say that the children's own culture is not important? So we need, again, to think about how we approach all of this. Language is built to communicate. Language is also built to think. And this is why I'm so keen for us to be language aware. We actually need to think about what we are saying, what we're doing, how we're presenting it in the classroom. And we must plan. There's a very simple way of looking at this as well. And that is to look at the way that we as teachers also present and talk to ourselves. Now, I personally have made a great effort to communicate as clearly and distinctively as I can. I often hear, particularly our politicians, but even our sports people, they do interviews and they haven't really learnt how to communicate accurately. And what I mean by that is when you put in colloquialisms, when you start by saying, well, and oh dear, well, oh dear. In other words, we forget, we don't think about speaking clearly. There's a standing joke within, certainly in Britain, about our wonderful soccer players, our footballers, and the typical footballer is asked, well, tell me about the game. What did you do? Did you win? And the typical footballer says, it was it was like a game of like two, like halves like. And you think, pardon, what language is he speaking? And it's very often people who have learnt English as their second, sometimes third language, who actually have a far better standard of English. It's not important to be word perfect. What is important is to communicate accurately. And this is the key to language awareness. If I can understand you, I'm not going to criticize the fact that you might not have got the tense quite correct, or there might have been a grammar slip, or you might have misused a word or left off something. If I can understand you and you can understand me, then we are communicating. And the more we learn to use the language and listen to each other, the better it will be. And this is what we think about as language aware. Now, Jim Cummings, who is in Canada, has done some very interesting work around this. And what he's talked about is what we consider as social language and academic language. Now, some of you may be very well familiar with this concept of the iceberg. And this concept of the iceberg, it's an analogy. It stands for something. And what we can see, the top of the iceberg, is what is referred to as BICS, basic interpersonal communication skills. I prefer to think about it as social language. It's our everyday, familiar language. Hello, how are you? What did you do at the weekend? Did you have a nice time? Did you go shopping? Did you go to the cinema? Tell me about what you did. Talk to me about your family. It's simple, it's surface level, it's here and now. And it often takes just a couple of years and you can get pretty fluent in social language. The hidden part is the challenge. Now, this is a fairly simplified. Cummins has gone on to actually do this and expand his model quite considerably into multiple languages. But for the moment, let's just think of it in a fairly simplified way. And CALP is what we call cognitive academic language proficiency. Great big thing for saying school language. It's the language of school. It's the language of the working life. And the expectation is that it has its own unique vocabulary. There are certain words which you only come across in that context, so that it takes somewhat longer. And the typical way of doing it is that a teacher and a student walk into school in the morning. It's the first day after the weekend, and you walk in there and you say to the student, "Oh, did you have a nice weekend?" In English, of course. And the student says, "Yes, we had a lovely weekend. We went down to the beach, we had a swim, we then went to the cafe and we had a lovely little meal," and so on. And you meet that student half an hour later in class, and you ask the student a question about perhaps a piece of reading that they're doing. And that same student who's spoken so freely and comfortably suddenly struggles. They really can't find the words to express themselves. And that is because they are fairly fluent in their social language, but they're struggling in their academic language. And when we think about this, we need to be aware of how this works in a classroom. So this little diagram is a way of looking at it. And what we have here on this vertical axis here is what we call context embedded, face-to-face, gestures, expressions. Unfortunately, with COVID, this is actually being somewhat reduced because we're all made to wear masks, and a face covering significantly reduces our context embedded. Context reduced is what we call lack of non-verbal cues. So that might be, for example, a telephone call where you can't actually see someone. You can't read their face. On the horizontal axis, we have what we call cognitively undemanding. It's simple language. And on the other side is the cognitively demanding language. And here in these quadrants are some typical lesson types. But unfortunately, I'm going to start right down at this bottom one. Our school system seems to be very, very focused on going straight into this quadrant, which is cognitively demanding and context reduced. We walk into the classroom, we say to our students in their second language, "Okay, open your books, let's get ready to start writing." And we're going straight into the most challenging language arena. What it would be lovely to see is that we have a variety of situations within our lessons, that we can start perhaps, especially with younger children, using stories, context embedded, face-to-face, talking to each other, using relatively simple language, and then we can move across this way. Oops, sorry, let's just go back. That was an unnecessary click, I'm sorry about that. And we can start thinking about using maths, manipulatives, things that they can touch, things that they can work with their hands, science, using pictures, so that we gradually build up the complexity. But we need to be aware of this. So we need to think when we're planning, when we're doing our lessons, what is it that we're doing? Are we going straight into the bottom right-hand corner? Is there perhaps an easier way that we can get into it to help our students? And I am all for giving our students as much help as we can. And this is what's coming up now. So I like to think about when we start planning for language awareness, we need to take 3 steps: content language, functional language, and language skills. So I'm going to take you through now perhaps some tips and ideas that I've developed over the years about how we can use these steps to improve what's going on in our classroom. So let's look at content language. And firstly, let's take a typical lesson. It might be secondary, it might even be at university. And we give the photo, we give our students a picture, and we say to them, describe that picture. We go straight in and we don't give them any guidance or anything at all. We say, describe that picture. And we even do that, I've seen this happening at primary level with simpler pictures. What we need to think about is, if we want our students to describe that, let's help them. Let's think, what words would they need to know in order to describe that picture? So I would say, okay, let's think about an English lesson. What words would we need to describe for that picture in English? And if we were teaching science, what would we need for teaching science? Now, whether you are an English teacher who doesn't have much science knowledge, or whether you're a science teacher who doesn't have much knowledge of English structure but uses English, it's the same, because you can do some collaborative planning, English and science together, but we can think about pre-teaching our key words. Use visuals, use TPR. TPR is a brilliant way of learning. TPR, total physical response. Very effective, as I'm sure you're aware, with younger students, but even older students. Even secondary school students can do TPR. They can act out the words. So here's a simple strategy to look and interpret photographs. All illustrations, any photo, divided into 3 sections. Divided into the background, in this case, the blue sky with the clouds, the foreground, which is the green grass in front, and the subject, which are the wind turbines. And then, if you can, to help the kids, you can divide each of those into 3 by asking them to look at the colors, perhaps look at the textures, and possibly look at some patterns. So that when you are asking them, this is a strategy, practice it, do it a few times, then it becomes embedded into their own way. It's a skill, it's a strategy. So that every time they look at a photograph, they think immediately background, foreground, subject. It's giving them a strategy to find the words, the ideas, the concepts in order to explain what they can see. So for example, if we look at the background, we could have words, deep blue sky. And I've said, what about something like thin, wispy clouds bullied into the corner? That's those ones up there. And we have dark, glowering clouds ganging up on the horizon. Look at them just there in the background. So now we can start giving our students strategies for developing how they look at something. We've got foreground. flowers like golden teardrops twinkling in the sun. I'm sure you can all see those. And the subject, tall, elegant turbines marching proudly across the verdant green landscape. So these are ideas that you can come up with, that you can teach. It's strategies that can be taught to our students, that when they look at something, after having practiced this, it becomes natural for them. If we're looking at science, we might need a different type of vocabulary. And here we need very specific words, because these are wind turbines. So we need to teach them. Turbine, what do? They generate electricity. There's a generator. It's on a tall tower. There has to be a motor in there. There are 3 blades. Each of those blades has an aerofoil section. They rotate about an axis. It's all to do with wind energy. And then some basic concepts. The wind pushes the blades that drive the turbine that rotates to generate electricity. So when we think about how we approach it and what we're doing, we need to be aware of the key words, the key ideas, the vocabulary for it. Here's an example that you might find in a textbook. There are pictures, and most of our students just look at those pictures and they say, well, what are we meant to do? But if you've taught them the strategies of looking at a background, foreground subject, that gives them the confidence to actually look at those pictures and say, I know I can do this. I know what I'm looking for. I know how it works. So it becomes something that encourages them to use their language to think. Within a Cambridge book, you might want to look at the teacher resource, read the learner's book, pick up some ideas and just check. And I'm absolutely in favor of giving students as much help as you can. That unfortunately, many of our school systems tend to say, well, we need to test our students. I need to make sure that they have learnt. So we're going to rush through this section. I will tell them what to think, and then I'll test them. And I really don't like that approach. I think that we need to say, let's help our students. In other words, within our classroom, let's put up posters, let's put up words, let's put up vocabulary, let's give them references that they can see. So when we're building it all in, think about scaffolding the content and their language. Give them help. Buildings don't go up by themselves. You need to help them. You need to give them support. And as we know when we're talking about scaffolding, it's a structure within which we can give support to the building, and in this case, the making meaning, the building of knowledge inside. Once that knowledge is built, we gradually take down, we can reduce the scaffold. So use flashcards, use placemats, use videos, use visuals. They don't just have that knowledge. We might have that knowledge as teachers. We might have a bit more than their students, but help them. Very simple one. It took me literally 2 minutes to type a few words onto a Word document, put them into a grid, print them off, cut them out, give them to the students. Let them have some help and let them actually then begin to make associations, draw pictures. In this particular case, here are the key words, draw pictures with them, cut them out, swap them with a partner and see if they can match them, match the words and the pictures. Very simple game. But what they're doing is they're thinking, they're using language, they are interacting, and they are communicating. So that you're doing activities that build up these ideas. If we use videos and visuals, make them appropriate. Don't give them a huge, long video of 15 minutes and say, okay, today, children, we're going to watch a video. And you don't tell them anything about it. They don't know why they're watching it. They don't know what they should be watching for. If we're going to use visuals, try and choose visuals that have high impact. Let's look at functional language very quickly. Functional language is the language that joins content language. It's the joining language. It's the everyday language. It's the language that makes links. It's the language that allows you to express yourselves. So, for example, is functional language. It's everyday language. It's the language that we might use. And if we are asking our children to agree or express opinions, then we want them to use the correct language, encourage it. So I think that, I agree with you, but have you considered? Make the links between the content and the functional language. You can get what we call placemats, which are simple phrases that you can print out, put them on the desk in front of them, alongside their content language, and then you're giving them the clues. And the more you practice the functional language, the easier the links become to the content language. And it will work when they make those links. That if they are able to suggest ways of expressing themselves and use what might be new language, the content language, alongside comfortable everyday language, it will improve confidence in language use. So that, again, within these ideas, there are lots of support and lots of ideas. And here you can see the scaffolding and the link between simple language and new content language. A reading scheme is a wonderful way of looking at it, because when we teach children, we can see mouse jumps in the cool water, and in the bottom of the corner, just down here, we see splash. Splash is written small. Here is our picture. We teach our students what's in the background, what's in the foreground, where's our subject. Our subject is mouse. Our foreground is the little pool. What color is it? Can you see the fishes? Is that a fish? What's in the background? We've got rocks, we've got ferns, we've got trees. We're helping our students manage this. There's a little splash there. Mouse jumps. Lion jumps in the cool water. Look at the background. What's happening in there? Can we see in the foreground? Lion's a little bit bigger. The drops of water are a little bit bigger. It's the foreground. Splash is a little bit bigger. Hippo jumps in the cool water. And what's happened? Oh dear, where's the water? What's happened? Why? Lots and lots of things to talk about in these pictures. So this is our, and as you'll see, there from the graphic that I've put on there, these are 3 separate pages from a very simple reading book. Mouse, lion, and hippo are the new content vocabulary. Jumps in the cool water is our typical functional language. So that it's repeated, but each time in context with new vocabulary. Final part of this is our typical language skills. And we all know what our language skills are. Now, I've put down at the bottom, I prefer an integrated approach. Many people like to separate out our language skills. They want to teach them discreetly, in other words, independently. And we will have a speaking lesson, a listening lesson, a reading lesson, a writing lesson. But that's artificial. Very rarely do we just speak, or just listen, or just read, or just write. We have to integrate them. We have to work and build those skills together, because communicating involves speaking, listening, reading, and writing. It's all of them together. We need to blend them. We need to work together. And, scaffold them. So, as you can see in that little picture I've put there, work in a group to describe a picture. So if they've got different strategies, you can ask them, okay, you work in the background, you work in the foreground, you work on the subject, one of you will pull them all together. Give them the strategies that they can then develop their language skills, because they'll have to speak, they'll have to listen to each other, they'll be reading, they'll be writing. It's an integrated approach. I want you to think very quickly, if you are a classroom teacher or if you are a senior school administrator and you go in and you watch what's happening in the classes, what language interactions actually happen in the classroom? Now, whenever I go into classroom, one of the things that I really see a lot of is teacher to student. Teachers are really good around the world. They really want to do the best they can for their students. And there's a lot of teacher and student interaction. But if you're in a class of 30, the teacher might be speaking to one student at a time. And if you're in a class of 30 and you've got perhaps a 35-minute, 40-minute lesson, you are not going to be able to speak and interact with every student individually, significantly in that one lesson. There will be some students who won't say or respond to anything in that lesson. So we really need to think about the language interactions that take place. And the best way of developing that is to encourage student-to-student interaction in pairs, in groups, by asking them to share a presentation, even if it's to small groups. But plan it. Think about what we are doing in our classroom. Teachers, I know, love to know that they're in control. That's what they want to show. That's what they want to do. So very quickly, this is, I've put up here, how would you teach this? This is the water cycle. It comes from a science book. And you can see what happens during the water cycle. And we can see all the words, the text on that page. There's a lovely picture there. So what I did with this one is I thought, okay, let's very quickly do some prompt cards for our students. And I've said, what can you see in the foreground? What can you see in the background? What can you see in the middle, perhaps the main subject? And we could break these up, these simple little cards, cut them out, give them to groups of students, and they shuffle them, and then they can use them as prompt cards to talk to each other about what it is they are seeing, doing, working on. So again, I'm very keen for a lot of prompting help. Give them. Last one.
5 more minutes.
Yes,
Excuse me. We've got five more minutes.
Yeah, I'm very nearly finished. I'm very nearly finished. I've got one more, and that is to think about what we call immersive learning. Now, this is my take on a typical language teaching strategy. When we teach language, we often talk about it's an immersive learning or an immersive language lesson. In other words, where we only use the target language. Now, I'm actually not in favor of only using the target language. I think that sometimes learning suffers if we stick with the target language only. I much prefer a bilingual style of teaching where we can use languages interdependently, not just translating, but for example, we can ask a student to, and particularly if we're teaching remotely, you might teach a lesson in English and you ask the student to tell their parents in Spanish what they've just been learning in English, so that it's not a translation. They're having to think, what have we been learning? Parents may not have as good English as their students, as their children. So therefore, the parents might want to ask the teacher a question, do it through talking to the child. Child talks in English. But what I've tried to say is we need to go for immersive learning. Give them a project where their learning and their language and their doing and their interactions are all bound up. They're all together. They're immersed in their task. They're not off task. They're not getting bored. Think back to the example I said of a child, teacher and student interaction, teacher talking to one student at a time. What are the rest doing? What are the rest doing? So we have a very simple, lots of projects within Cambridge Books that we can think about doing. So lots of group work. Okay, we've come to the end. And the why, the what, and the how. I hope that after this, you've managed to pull it all together within Europe and within Cambridge, because we did this. We tried to link it all. There is the common European framework of reference for languages. It doesn't matter what language you're learning, there is a common standard and approach. And those are the language levels. I'm sure you're all familiar with them, but they do help us in thinking about where we are on our language journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. A very interesting presentation. And now we have about 10 minutes for questions and answers.
Absolutely.
Okay, and here we go. And this question is from
would you like me to have a look
Alex
at the box as well?
Oh, sure. Yes,
I can do that.
of course.
And,
of course. Yes.
See?
Yes,
is it
there,
a Q&A
yes.
or is it a chat box?
There's a chat box. There's a chat box. And here's a question from Patricia Barca. She's asking, how can we deal with shy students, even when teaching functional language? How can we encourage them to participate?
Okay, the key for me in encouraging shy students to participate is not to make them speak up in front of the class. That often they are embarrassed to speak out loud in front of everyone. So where we can, try and get those students to talk to their friends, talk to small groups, so that when they're doing that, they are not embarrassed to speak in front of everyone. This is often the big challenge, as I mentioned earlier, about the teacher and the student. As teachers, we want to encourage our shy students, but unfortunately what we tend to do is we tend to ask them a direct question in front of everyone in the class, and they don't want to answer that. So instead of asking and getting the shy students almost to be embarrassed, say, I'm going to ask a question of everyone, tell your partner the answer, and then once you've expressed the answer to your friends, ask someone to volunteer an answer. And in that way, you're involving everyone. The shy children are getting an opportunity to participate without embarrassment.
Thank you, Simon. And here's another question from a preschool teacher, Alex Torres. He's been a teacher for 20 years, a bilingual teacher, and he's got amazing learners, and he teaches in an Immersive program and with TPR as well. And the problem is that during this pandemic, it's been very hard to teach through the screen, through the web. So what kind of skills and strategies teachers must develop in order to empower connection with little kids?
We had a big challenge on this, that we had very much the same thing. I did some research into this. We looked at a lot of it, and much of the research has come up that for the youngest children, the children just in school, the children who are 6, 7, and so on, probably the single most important thing that we can do for those children is encourage them to read. So reading stories, sharing books, not always online, because sometimes they struggle with that, but it is building up, building up their reading skills. And they don't necessarily have to do much in the way of maths and science and so on, but actually we want to build up their reading. And you can do that by giving them, let them read together, read individually, read online, but focus on the storytelling, not necessarily the reading of textbooks, but on the storytelling. So that I've showed you a little picture of the mouse, the lion, the hippo jumping in. Those are simple reading books. And they lend themselves beautifully to talking about what you're reading. Look at the pictures, have a discussion about that. The challenge with online and younger children is the technology is sometimes a blocker, but most children love stories. And for me, it doesn't really matter if they're bilingual, if they're working together, it's the reading that is the key element.
Thank you, Simon. And here's another question from Diego Fuentes. He's a secondary teacher, and he's asking if these ideas would also work with senior students.
Yes, very much so. It is actually very surprising that we tend to think, and I taught mostly senior students, I taught older students, but actually, and even when I work with teachers, so even when I work with adults and I do picture work with adults, it is amazing how people can look but not see, that we need to teach them these kind of strategies. Again, I've been into classes where the teacher, very experienced teacher, has been teaching the same subject, the same group for year after year after year. And they use the same words from year to year to year. They don't develop their own vocabulary. The children don't develop a vocabulary. So these strategies that I've presented, they might seem as if they don't suit senior students, but they do. We still need to teach these kind of strategies to senior students. They still need this scaffolding.
All right. And one more question from Sofia Montana Fernandino. She says, regarding student-to-student oral communication, in your experience, can you tell us what strategies have you observed that create a learning environment where the teacher does not have to go around the classroom saying, please speak English a million times?
That is always a great challenge. And there is no one, if you like, magic strategy that will do that. The most successful strategies that I've done is, or that I've seen happening and that I've used as well, is to give them a very, very clearly defined task and sets of words that they need to use. So that if you set a very clear task, most teachers, unfortunately, they will present a topic and then they say, now talk to your partner about this. But they don't say to them, use these words, practice these sentences, put them in context. So model the way that it should be done. So get a couple of students up, let them show what it should be, and then put the onus on the students to assess each other. And by doing that, you are encouraging them. You can't force them. You'll never be able to force the students, because this is what I was talking a little bit about earlier, that English might be our working language, but it's not our home language. And you put them, friends, together, they would normally speak Spanish all the time, but suddenly you're asking them to speak English together in a class. It's an artificial situation. So you need to give them something real to talk about and the words, the sentences, and the vocabulary to use. Encourage that to do. It is a challenge, but the most successful that I've seen, provide prompt cards, provide them with visual clues, reminders, give them the scaffolding that they can use without embarrassment. And if they make a mistake, it doesn't matter. This is what the communication is all about.
Okay, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. And it says, this is from Elizabeth Dantas. Please give us an example of how we can use immersive language with very young learners.
Again, the most useful for very young learners, not in huge experience of that, but my colleagues have, and the best way of getting them is storytelling. It's storytelling and it's working through the stories. Give them something to identify, and the key one is they must use the words and the language that they're seeing in the stories. So that if you're reading them a story, ask them to repeat it. What would you say? What do you think he would say next? So that when you are immersed in the story, they're more likely to be less embarrassed and to identify with the characters that they can see and be. And if they slip into Spanish, it doesn't matter. They're identifying with it, they're communicating, but do it through stories. If you try and do it through formal texts and put them in artificial situations, they're really going to be very unsure about it. I love it through stories. Again, I've seen, we have some fabulous authors in our CRA, and we sent an author who's a storyteller. He's actually a storyteller. We sent him out to Turkey to work with schools and children. And he just sat there and he taught, and he told them stories. And these children were absolutely hooked on what he was saying. And they loved it. Use stories.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon, for your presentation and all your answers and suggestions and ideas. I'm sure all teachers have learned from you and will apply this when they go back to school or when they meet with their students again. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon. Hope to see you soon. Well, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I hope that people found that interesting and useful. I hope it was worthwhile. And please, if you do something like this again, please invite me again. It was lovely to be able to interact with you all. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening to me. I hope that you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, teachers, for all your questions. Sorry, we didn't have time to answer them all, but I'm sure that when we send you the backup information of videos of all the presentations, you'll be able to find the answers, but you can always write to us. Now we have a break, so we can, maybe get something to eat or drink some water. And our next, we're meeting at 2:50, remember, 2:50, and our next presenter is Antonella Sorace. She will be talking about bilingualism matters, so it's a very interesting topic too. So see you then. See you at 2:15. Bye-bye.